Long before there was anything called Greece, long before philosophers debated the nature of existence or armies marched under the banners of city-states, the Aegean world was already alive with complex civilizations that would quietly lay the foundation for everything that followed. This is not the story of a single empire rising in a straight line. It is a story of cultures forming, collapsing, remembering, and rebuilding themselves across centuries of uncertainty. After the collapse of the Mycenaean world, Greece did not immediately rebuild itself into something greater. What followed was not a rapid transformation, but a long period of quiet restructuring where the old systems had already fallen apart, yet the new systems had not fully formed. This was the age historians later called the Greek Dark Age, not because nothing happened, but because the world of written records, centralized administration, and large-scale palace economies had disappeared. At first, it would have felt like a loss of complexity. The great fortresses were no longer functioning as administrative centers. Trade networks that once connected the Aegean to Egypt, Anatolia, and the wider Near East became fragmented. Populations in many regions declined, and settlements became smaller, more scattered, and more locally focused. Without the palace systems that had once organized labor, storage, and distribution, communities had to adapt to a more immediate and self-sufficient way of life. But this was not a total collapse into chaos. It was a reorganization into something simpler, more local, and more flexible. Villages and small communities replaced palace-centered states. Leadership became less formalized, often based on local influence, family ties, and military capability rather than centralized authority. The scale of political life shrank, but it did not disappear. And in this quieter, less structured world, something crucial was happening beneath the surface. Identity was being preserved, not through writing, but through memory. Without widespread literacy or administrative record-keeping, knowledge of the past was carried orally. Stories became the vessel through which history survived. Tales of the Mycenaean heroes, the great wars, and the interactions between gods and mortals were passed down by generations of storytellers. These narratives were not fixed. They evolved with each telling, shaped by audience, region, and cultural need. Over time, these oral traditions became more than just memory. They became structure. They provided a shared framework for understanding the world. In a time without strong political unification, mythology began to serve as a unifying cultural system. The gods of Olympus, who would later dominate Greek religion, took on more defined roles during this period of oral development. Zeus emerged as the authority figure among the gods, representing order and power. Athene came to symbolize wisdom and strategic thought. Apollo represented prophecy, music, and clarity. Poseidon embodied the unpredictable force of the sea. Each deity reflected not just spiritual belief, but aspects of human experience interpreted through divine symbolism. Religion in this period was not separate from daily life. It was embedded within it. Rituals, offerings, and local sacred sites played a central role in maintaining community cohesion. Even without large centralized temples in many areas, people still engaged with the divine through smaller shrines, local practices, and inherited traditions. And although political structures were fragmented, cultural continuity remained surprisingly strong. Because even in the absence of empires or kingdoms, people still shared a common language family, common myths, and common rituals. This shared cultural foundation would become the basis for future unification, even though political unity itself would not exist for centuries. Gradually, toward the end of this period, signs of change began to appear again. Writing returned to Greece, but in a new form. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet, modifying it to better suit their own language. This development was transformative. It allowed communication to be recorded more efficiently, enabling laws, poetry, trade records, and historical memory to be preserved once again in written form. This moment marked the transition out of the Dark Age. Not through sudden revolution, but through gradual recovery. Communities began to grow in size and complexity. Trade slowly expanded again across the Aegean and beyond. Population levels increased, and settlements began to evolve into more structured urban centers. The foundations of what would become the Greek city-state system were being laid. These emerging communities would eventually be known as polis, independent city-states that would define Greek political life for centuries. But in this transitional period, they were still forming their identities. Leadership structures varied. Some were ruled by aristocratic families, others by emerging tyrants who gained power through popular or military support, and others still through evolving civic institutions. What remained constant was fragmentation. Greece did not unify into a single political entity. Instead, it became a landscape of independent communities, each developing its own identity, governance, and local traditions. But despite this political fragmentation, cultural unity persisted. The myths, gods, and shared memories of the past still connected these communities to one another. A farmer in one region and a sailor in another might belong to different city-states, but they still recognized the same gods, told variations of the same stories, and participated in overlapping religious festivals. This shared cultural framework would become one of the defining features of Greek civilization. It allowed identity without empire, connection without centralization. And as these city-states continued to grow, they would begin to interact more frequently, both cooperatively and competitively. Trade routes expanded again across the Mediterranean. Greek settlements began appearing along coastal regions far beyond the mainland, establishing colonies that would spread Greek language, culture, and religious practices across a wider world. This process was not centralized or coordinated by a single authority. It was the result of many independent decisions made by different city-states, responding to population pressure, economic opportunity, and maritime exploration. At the same time, internal development within these city-states continued. Social structures became more defined. Laws were written down in some regions, creating early legal systems that helped regulate civic life. Military organization also evolved, with citizen soldiers beginning to play a more central role in defending their communities. By the end of this period, Greece was no longer in a state of collapse or recovery. It was entering a new phase entirely. A phase defined not by kings or palaces, but by cities. Independent, competing, and culturally connected. And from this fragmented foundation, the classical world of Greece would soon emerge. But before that world could reach its height, it would first need to define itself more clearly. Through politics, through warfare, and through the shared systems of belief that continued to shape every aspect of Greek life. The earliest major civilization to emerge in this region was the Minoan world on the island of Crete. At a time when much of Europe was still developing in scattered tribal systems, the Minoans built something far more structured. Their society was centered around large palace complexes like Knossos, which were not just royal residences, but administrative, economic, and religious hubs all at once. Within these structures, goods were stored, trade was managed, records were kept, and rituals were performed. It was a civilization that did not separate politics from religion or economy from culture. Everything was interconnected. What makes the Minoans especially fascinating is how advanced they were in maritime trade. The sea was not a barrier to them, but a highway. Through it, they connected Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and other Aegean islands into a network of exchange. Goods such as pottery, metals, and textiles moved across these waters, but so too did ideas, artistic styles, and religious influences. In many ways, the Mediterranean world was already becoming interconnected long before classical Greece existed. And yet, even in their sophistication, the Minoans left behind a mystery that still lingers. Their writing system, known as Linear A, has never been fully deciphered. We can see that they recorded information, likely for administrative purposes, but we cannot fully read their language. So much of their internal world remains just out of reach, hidden behind symbols we cannot fully interpret. Then, on the mainland of Greece, another civilization was rising. The Mycenaeans. If the Minoans were defined by maritime trade and palace culture, The Mycenaeans were defined by fortresses, warfare, and hierarchy. Their world was built around heavily fortified citadels such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These were not open coastal trade centers like those in Crete. They were defensive strongholds, suggesting a society more focused on control, protection, and military organization. Mycenaean society was ruled by a figure known as the Wanax, a kind of king who controlled both political and military power. Beneath him was a structured hierarchy of officials, landholders, and laborers, all contributing to a system that relied heavily on resource management and tribute. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans left behind a decipherable script called Linear B, which reveals a great deal about their administrative systems. We can see records of grain distribution, military equipment, religious offerings, and land ownership. This was not a simple society. It was a highly organized early state system. And yet, despite their strength, the Mycenaeans are also tied to one of the most famous stories in human history: the Trojan War tradition. Whether or not the events described in later epic poetry correspond directly to historical events, what matters is that the memory of conflict between Mycenaean Greece and the city of Troy became one of the central narrative foundations of Greek identity. In the Iliad, we see a world of heroic warriors, divine intervention, personal honor, and brutal warfare. Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, and Odysseus are not just characters. They are reflections of how early Greeks understood strength, fate, and the relationship between humans and gods. And that relationship is important because in the Greek world, the boundary between mythology and reality was never fully fixed. Myths were not simply stories told for entertainment. They were explanations of the world, frameworks for understanding human behavior, and reflections of cultural values. Gods intervened in battles. Heroes were descendants of divine beings. Fate was not abstract, it was personal and active. But just as these civilizations reached their height, something began to change across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Around the end of the Bronze Age, roughly the 12th century BCE, a widespread collapse began to unfold. It was not a single event, but a chain reaction of disruptions affecting multiple interconnected societies. Trade networks that had supported the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and other cultures began to break down. Cities were abandoned. Writing systems disappeared in some regions. Political structures that had taken centuries to build were suddenly no longer sustainable. The Mycenaean palace system collapsed. Fortresses were destroyed or abandoned. Administrative records ceased. Populations declined in many areas, and large-scale organization gave way to smaller, more localized communities. This period is often called the Greek Dark Age, but the term can be misleading. It was not a total absence of culture or life. Rather, it was a period of transformation, where older systems disappeared and new ones slowly began to form in their place. Writing was lost in mainland Greece for centuries, meaning that historical memory from this period survives mainly through later oral traditions rather than direct records. And yet, this is where something remarkable happens. Because even though written records disappeared, stories did not. They survived in spoken form, passed down through generations of poets and storytellers who preserved fragments of the Mycenaean world in narrative form. Over time, these stories became more structured, more symbolic, and more culturally central. They were no longer just memories of a past civilization. They became foundational myths. This is where Homeric tradition begins to take shape. Epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey are not simply historical accounts. They are cultural reconstructions of a lost age, shaped by memory, imagination, and evolving identity. Through them, the Greeks of later periods connected themselves to a heroic past that may have been partially real, partially remembered, and partially reinvented. And that connection mattered deeply, because in the absence of written history, mythology became history. Not in the modern sense of factual accuracy, but in the sense of cultural truth. These stories explained where people came from. They explained why the world was structured the way it was. They explained why gods behaved as they did, why heroes suffered, and why fate played such a central role in human life. Even the gods themselves were not distant abstractions. They were deeply human in behavior. Zeus ruled but was flawed. Athene represented wisdom but also strategy and war. Poseidon reflected the unpredictability of the sea. Apollo embodied order, prophecy, and light, but also distance and severity. These gods were not separate from humanity. They were projections of human experience elevated into divine form. And in this way, mythology became more than belief. It became a system of meaning. So when the Greek world eventually began to rebuild after the Dark Age, it did not start from nothing. It started with memory, with story, with identity preserved through narrative rather than record. And slowly, from these scattered communities, something new began to emerge. Not a single empire, not a unified kingdom, but a world of independent city-states, each developing its own identity, its own politics, and its own interpretation of the gods and the past. This would become the foundation of classical Greek civilization, and it would change the ancient world forever. But before that world could rise, Greece first had to rediscover itself. And that process had only just begun. As Greece emerged from the slow recovery of the Dark Age, it did not rebuild itself into a single unified kingdom or empire. Instead, something very different took shape, something that would define Greek civilization for centuries to come. Across the mainland and the islands, small independent communities began to organize themselves into what the Greeks called polis, or city-states. Each polis was its own world, its own identity, its own political reality. At the center of each city-state was an urban core, usually built around a fortified hill or elevated acropolis, where temples and important civic buildings were placed. Surrounding this was the countryside, the agricultural land that sustained the population and defined the economic strength of the city. But what made the polis unique was not just its geography. It was the idea that political life was local, participatory, and deeply tied to community identity. There was no single king ruling over all Greece. There was no central authority unifying these cities. Instead, there were dozens, then hundreds, of independent political entities, each developing in its own direction, shaped by local conditions, resources, and social structures. And yet, despite this fragmentation, the Greeks did not see themselves as completely separate peoples. They shared a language family. They shared religious traditions. They shared myths that connected them to a common heroic past. And they shared the idea that they were part of a broader cultural world, even if they were politically divided. This tension between unity and fragmentation would define Greek history for centuries. Among these emerging city-states, two would eventually become especially influential: Sparta and Athens. But in this early period, they were still developing their identities. Sparta, located in the region of Laconia, would eventually become known for its rigid military structure and disciplined social system, but its foundations were built gradually through conquest and control of neighboring populations. The Spartan system relied heavily on the subjugation of the Helot population, who worked the land, while Spartan citizens focused almost entirely on military training and governance. This created a society where discipline, obedience, and warfare were central values. Athens, by contrast, developed along a different path. Located in Attica, Athens began as a monarchy but gradually shifted toward aristocratic and then more broadly participatory forms of governance. This transition was not immediate or peaceful. It involved internal tensions between elite families, social classes, and emerging political ideas about law and citizenship. But what made Athens especially significant was its gradual movement toward political participation. Law codes were introduced to regulate civic life. Reforms began to limit the absolute power of aristocratic elites. Over time, these developments laid the groundwork for what would eventually become democracy. Although in its earliest forms, it was still limited and far from universal participation. During this same period, something else was happening that would reshape Greek identity across all city-states. Writing had returned, but it returned transformed. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet, modifying it to represent vowel sounds more clearly, making it one of the most efficient writing systems of the ancient world. This innovation allowed laws, trade agreements, poetry, and public records to be written and preserved more easily than before. Writing changed everything. Because once ideas could be recorded, they could be shared more widely and preserved more permanently. This had profound effects on law, governance, and culture. In some city-states, laws were carved into stone and displayed publicly, making them visible and accessible to citizens. This reduced the arbitrary exercise of power and created more structured civic systems. At the same time, religion continued to play a central role in Greek life. The gods of Olympus were now firmly established in Greek religious imagination. Zeus stood as the king of the gods, representing authority and cosmic order. Athene embodied wisdom, strategy, and civic protection. Apollo represented prophecy, music, and harmony. Artemis symbolized nature and independence. Poseidon ruled the sea, powerful and unpredictable. Aphrodite represented desire and beauty, while Ares embodied war in its more chaotic form. These gods were not distant abstractions. They were present in daily life. Temples were built in their honor, sacrifices were offered, and festivals were held to maintain favor and connection with divine forces. The relationship between humans and gods was not passive. It was transactional, emotional, and deeply embedded in civic identity. Every city-state often had its own favored deity or mythological patron, which helped reinforce local identity while still connecting each polis to the wider Greek religious system. The Oracle of Delphi became one of the most important religious centers in the Greek world. Leaders from across the Mediterranean would travel there seeking guidance from the god Apollo, interpreting cryptic prophecies that influenced political and military decisions. Religion and politics were not separate domains. They were intertwined at every level. As these city-states developed, competition between them also increased. Limited land, growing populations, and rising economic activity pushed many communities to look beyond their borders. This led to one of the most important processes in early Greek expansion, colonization. Greek colonies were established across the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, from southern Italy and Sicily to parts of Asia Minor and beyond. These were not colonies in the modern imperial sense, but rather independent settlements founded by groups from existing city-states. They maintained cultural and religious ties to their mother cities, but operated politically on their own. This expansion spread Greek language, religion, and cultural practices across a wide geographic area, creating a network of interconnected communities that shared identity even without political unity. Trade also expanded significantly during this period. Greek merchants exchanged goods such as pottery, wine, olive oil, metals, and textiles across vast distances. This economic activity strengthened the prosperity of many city-states and increased contact with neighboring civilizations. But even as Greece expanded outward, internal differences between city-states became more pronounced. Sparta and Athens, in particular, represented two increasingly distinct models of Greek society. One focused on military discipline and stability through control. The other increasingly explored political participation and civic identity. This contrast would eventually shape the conflicts and philosophical developments of later Greek history. At the same time, early forms of philosophy began to emerge in the Greek world. Thinkers in regions such as Ionia began to ask questions about the nature of reality, the structure of the universe, and the principles underlying natural phenomena. These early philosophers moved away from purely mythological explanations and began seeking rational or observational foundations for understanding the world. This shift did not replace mythology, but it began to exist alongside it. And that coexistence would become one of the defining characteristics of Greek intellectual life. By the end of this period, Greece was no longer in recovery from collapse. It was fully transformed into a world of city-states, interconnected through culture, trade, religion, and shared identity, but divided politically and increasingly shaped by internal competition and external expansion. And as these forces continued to develop, Greece was moving toward a new era. One defined not just by formation and expansion, but by conflict, philosophy, and the rise of civilizations that would test the limits of the Greek world itself. By the time Greek city-states had fully formed across the Aegean world, something else had already become deeply embedded in every layer of society, something that did not belong to a single city, a single ruler, or even a single generation. It belonged to the entire Greek world at once. Religion. But not religion in the narrow sense of private belief or distant worship. In ancient Greece, religion was not separate from politics, identity, or daily life. It was the structure through which reality itself was interpreted. Every decision, from planting crops to declaring war, existed within a framework shaped by divine presence. The Greeks did not ask whether the gods were real in the way modern thinking often separates belief from fact. Instead, they lived within a world where the gods were assumed to be active participants in human affairs. Not distant creators, but present forces woven into nature, emotion, and fate itself. At the center of this system stood the Olympian gods. And they were not abstract concepts. They were personalities. Zeus, the king of the gods, represented authority, order, and the unpredictable nature of power itself. He ruled the sky, controlled lightning, and enforced a kind of cosmic hierarchy among gods and mortals alike. Yet even Zeus was not absolute in the modern sense of omnipotence. He could be challenged by fate, influenced by other gods, and bound by older cosmic forces that even he could not fully control. This detail is important, because Greek mythology was not about perfect beings. It was about powerful but limited beings. Athene, born from Zeus's mind in myth, embodied wisdom, strategy, and civic intelligence. She was not just a goddess of war, but of calculated war, of structured thinking, of cities and law. Athens itself took its name from her, showing how deeply mythology and political identity were connected. Poseidon ruled the sea, unpredictable and vast, reflecting both the danger and necessity of maritime life in the Greek world. For a civilization built across islands and coastlines, the sea was not just geography, it was survival. And so Poseidon was both feared and respected, honored, but carefully managed through ritual. Apollo represented order, prophecy, music, and clarity. Through him, the Greeks sought meaning in uncertainty. His most famous oracle at Delphi became one of the most influential religious sites in the ancient world. Leaders, generals, and entire city-states would consult the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, before making major decisions. The answers were often cryptic, symbolic, and open to interpretation, which meant that divine will was always intertwined with human interpretation. And that is another key feature of Greek religion. It was not purely directive. It was interpretive. The gods spoke, but humans had to understand what was meant. This created a constant interaction between fate and free will, between divine influence and human responsibility. Alongside these major Olympian figures existed a vast network of lesser gods, spirits, and local deities tied to rivers, forests, cities, and natural forces. Every region had its own sacred associations. Religion was not centralized. It was distributed across landscapes and communities. And this distribution helped unify Greece without central control. Because even though city-states were politically independent, they shared the same mythological framework. The same gods, the same stories, the same heroic past. Mythology itself became a kind of shared memory system. Stories like the labors of Heracles, the journey of Odysseus, the tragedy of Oedipus, or the divine conflicts among Olympian gods were not just entertainment. They were cultural explanations for human behavior, morality, and the unpredictability of life. Heracles represented struggle and endurance. Odysseus represented intelligence, adaptation, and survival through cunning. Oedipus represented fate, ignorance, and the tragic limits of human understanding. These figures were not distant legends. They were frameworks through which Greeks understood themselves. Even suffering had meaning within myth. Even chaos had structure. Temples across Greece were physical expressions of this belief system. They were not places where gods physically lived, but sacred spaces where human and divine worlds intersected. Rituals, sacrifices, and festivals maintained this connection. Offerings were made not to control the gods, but to maintain balance and favor. And this balance was essential. Because the Greek worldview assumed that harmony between humans and divine forces was necessary for stability in both personal and civic life. Religion also shaped politics directly. Before wars, city-states often sought divine approval. Before founding colonies, leaders consulted oracles. Even laws and civic decisions were sometimes influenced by religious interpretation. There was no clear separation between sacred and political authority. The most famous religious center in Greece was Delphi. Nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, it was believed to be the center of the world, marked by the stone known as the Omphalos. Here, the oracle of Apollo delivered prophecies that shaped decisions across the Greek world. The ambiguity of these prophecies meant that interpretation often mattered more than the message itself, and different city-states could act on the same oracle in entirely different ways. This made religion both unifying and flexible. It connected Greece culturally while allowing political independence to continue. As Greek civilization expanded through colonization and trade, mythology traveled with it. New settlements carried their gods, rituals, and stories to distant lands, creating a shared cultural identity across the Mediterranean world. Even in foreign environments, Greek settlers maintained religious continuity through temples, festivals, and storytelling. But mythology also evolved. Local traditions merged with Greek gods. Foreign deities were reinterpreted through Greek frameworks. Over time, this created a flexible religious system capable of absorbing new influences without losing its core structure. And beneath all of this, something important was beginning to emerge. A shift in how humans understood the world. Because while mythology explained reality through divine action, early philosophical thought was beginning to ask whether reality could also be explained through natural principles. This did not immediately replace mythology, but it began to exist alongside it. And in that coexistence, Greek civilization developed one of the most powerful intellectual traditions in history. A tradition where gods and reason, myth and logic could exist in tension without fully eliminating each other. And that tension would shape everything that came next. Because as Greece moved toward its classical age, religion would no longer just explain the world. It would begin to compete with new ways of understanding it. As Greece moved further out of its dark age and into what historians call the Archaic period, the world of the Greek city-states began to expand in ways that were no longer limited by the narrow geography of the mainland. What had once been a collection of recovering communities slowly transformed into a network of active, outward-looking societies connected through trade, migration, and shared cultural identity. And at the heart of this transformation was movement. Not conquest in the imperial sense, but expansion through settlement. Greek populations were growing, and in many regions, arable land was limited. This pressure created a natural push outward as groups from different city-states began to establish new settlements across the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. These settlements were not extensions of a single empire. They were independent cities founded by Greek communities who maintained cultural ties to their origin cities but governed themselves autonomously. This process is what later historians call Greek colonization. But it is important to understand what that meant in practice. A group of settlers would leave their home polis, often guided by an official decision, religious consultation, or economic necessity. They would travel across the sea, establish a new settlement, and build a city structured on Greek cultural and religious principles. They brought with them their language, their gods, their rituals, and their political traditions. And once established, these new cities would grow into fully independent polis. This meant that by this period, Greek civilization was no longer confined to the mainland or even the Aegean islands. It had spread across a vast maritime network, from southern Italy and Sicily to parts of modern-day France, Spain, North Africa, and the Black Sea coast. The Greek world had become something larger than geography. It had become cultural. But even as it expanded outward, Greece remained politically fragmented. There was no central authority coordinating this expansion, no empire directing colonization. Each city-state made its own decisions based on local pressures, opportunities, and internal dynamics. This is where the uniqueness of Greek civilization becomes clearer. Expansion without empire. Unity without centralization. Connection without control. And yet, despite this fragmentation, there was still a strong sense of shared identity. Greeks across different regions recognized each other through language, religion, and cultural practice. They called themselves Hellenes, and they referred to their shared world as Hellas. This identity was not political, it was cultural and linguistic. And one of the strongest forces maintaining that shared identity was religion. The Olympian gods were worshipped across the entire Greek world, regardless of political boundaries. Zeus was Zeus in every city-state. Athene, Apollo, Poseidon, and the rest of the pantheon formed a shared mythological system that transcended political division. This meant that even in a fragmented world, there was still a common framework of meaning. Religious festivals also played a major role in maintaining this unity. Events like the Olympic Games were not just athletic competitions. They were religious gatherings dedicated to Zeus, bringing together representatives from across the Greek world. During these festivals, conflicts between city-states were often paused, allowing for a temporary sense of shared identity. But beneath this cultural unity, political tensions were still growing. Because expansion also meant competition. As trade routes expanded and colonies grew richer, wealth began to accumulate unevenly across different city-states. Some cities, particularly those with strong maritime access, became wealthy commercial centers. Others, more landlocked or militarized, developed different forms of power. This economic imbalance began to influence political development. In many city-states, traditional aristocratic systems of rule were challenged by new social groups. Wealthy merchants, craftsmen, and landowners who were not part of the old noble families began to demand greater political influence. This tension led to internal political shifts in many regions. One of the most common outcomes was the rise of tyrants. In the Greek context, a tyrant was not necessarily a cruel ruler in the modern sense. Instead, it referred to an individual who seized power outside traditional aristocratic structures, often with popular support. Many tyrants implemented reforms, strengthened infrastructure, and stabilized internal conflict. However, their rule also highlighted the instability of traditional systems. At the same time, written law began to play a larger role in Greek political life. In several city-states, laws were recorded and publicly displayed, reducing the arbitrary power of elites and making governance more transparent. This shift toward codified law marked an important step in the development of civic institutions. And yet, even as politics evolved, religion remained deeply embedded in all aspects of life. Every major political decision still involved consultation with the gods. Colonization itself often began with religious guidance from oracles. The founding of new cities was frequently associated with divine approval. The boundaries between political strategy and religious interpretation remained fluid. This blending of religion and governance created a world where decisions were never purely rational in the modern sense. They were always influenced by divine interpretation, cultural tradition, and human ambition. Meanwhile, Greek culture itself was becoming more defined. Poetry, especially epic poetry, became one of the most important forms of cultural expression. The works attributed to Homer, including the Iliad and the Odyssey, were not just stories. They were cultural frameworks that encoded values such as honor, loyalty, intelligence, and the relationship between humans and fate. These epics also reinforced the idea that the Greek world had a shared heroic past, even if that past was mythologized. Heroes like Achilles and Odysseus became symbolic figures representing idealized human traits and struggles. At the same time, new forms of poetry and thought were emerging in different regions. Lyric poetry began to express personal emotion more directly, while early philosophical thinkers started to question traditional explanations of the world. These developments marked a subtle but important shift. Greek civilization was beginning to reflect on itself, not just through myth, but through observation and reasoning. By the end of the Archaic period, Greece had transformed from a fragmented post-Dark Age recovery society into a culturally unified but politically divided world of expanding city-states. It was a civilization connected by language, religion, and shared tradition, but shaped by competition, innovation, and constant movement. And this balance between unity and division would define everything that came next. Because as Greece entered its classical age, it would face pressures that tested not only its political systems, but the very idea of Greek identity itself. By the time Greece entered its classical era, the world of city-states had already become intensely defined by contrast. Dozens of polis existed across the Greek landscape, each with its own laws, customs, and political systems, but two in particular began to stand out not just for their power, but for the completely different paths they chose to follow. Athens and Sparta. Two cities, two systems, two visions of what Greek civilization could become. Sparta's identity was forged through control and discipline. Located in the region of Laconia, it developed not as a maritime trading center or a cultural hub, but as a militarized society built on constant readiness for conflict. This structure was not accidental. It emerged from conquest and domination over neighboring populations, particularly the Helots, who formed a large enslaved workforce responsible for agriculture and economic production. This system created a unique social structure where a small population of Spartan citizens could dedicate their entire lives to military training and governance. From childhood, Spartan boys were placed into the agoge system, a rigorous state-controlled education focused on endurance, obedience, and combat readiness. Life in Sparta was not centered on artistic achievement, philosophical inquiry, or trade expansion. It was centered on survival through military strength. And that strength became legendary. Sparta was not large, but it was feared. Athens, however, developed along a very different trajectory. Situated in Attica, it began as a monarchy but gradually transitioned into more complex political systems influenced by internal reform and social pressure. Unlike Sparta's rigid structure, Athens became a place of experimentation, where political power slowly shifted from aristocratic families toward broader civic participation. This transformation did not happen smoothly. It was shaped by tension between rich and poor, between elites and emerging middle classes, and between tradition and reform. Early lawmakers such as Solon introduced reforms aimed at reducing inequality and preventing internal collapse. These reforms did not create democracy immediately, but they laid the foundation for a system where political participation could expand beyond narrow elite control. And that idea changed everything. Because in Athens, the concept of citizenship began to take on a more active meaning. Citizens were not just subjects of a ruler. They were participants in decision-making processes that shaped the direction of the city-state. Over time, institutions like the assembly and councils allowed broader segments of the population to engage in governance, although participation was still limited by modern standards. But even in its early form, this shift represented something historically significant. It was the beginning of political experimentation on a large scale. While Sparta emphasized stability through control, Athens began to explore stability through participation. And this difference would eventually define much of Greek history. At the same time, both city-states remained deeply embedded in the shared religious and cultural framework of Greece. Neither Athens nor Sparta existed outside the influence of the Olympian gods, mythological tradition, or Panhellenic identity. Temples, rituals, and festivals continued to play a central role in both societies, even if their political systems diverged. Athene, in particular, became deeply associated with Athens itself. As a goddess of wisdom, strategy, and civic order, she represented many of the values Athens began to associate with itself. The Parthenon, built later in her honor, would become one of the most iconic symbols of Greek civilization, but even in this earlier period, her influence shaped the city's identity. Sparta, meanwhile, maintained a strong association with gods like Ares and Artemis, reflecting its focus on war, discipline, and controlled strength. Religion did not divide these cities, but it reinforced their identities. As these two systems developed, Greece as a whole became more polarized in its political models. Some city-states leaned toward oligarchic systems dominated by elites, others experimented with more participatory governance, and others still were ruled by tyrants who had seized power during periods of instability. Despite these differences, all Greek city-states remained connected through shared language, religious practices, and cultural traditions. The Olympic Games continued to serve as a symbolic gathering point where Greeks from different regions could compete, interact, and temporarily set aside political conflict in the name of shared identity. But beneath this cultural unity, tensions were growing. Because different political systems naturally led to different strategic interests. Athens, with its growing naval power and expanding trade networks, began to develop influence beyond its immediate region. Its maritime strength allowed it to build alliances and exert control over parts of the Aegean through economic and military means. Sparta, on the other hand, maintained a more land-based, conservative approach, focusing on internal stability and regional dominance in the Peloponnesian area. This divergence created a slow-building rivalry. Not immediate war, but long-term tension. At the same time, Greek intellectual life was beginning to shift in subtle but important ways. Early philosophers, particularly in the Ionian regions, started to question traditional mythological explanations of the world. Instead of attributing natural phenomena solely to divine action, they began seeking underlying principles based on observation, reasoning, and natural processes. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus began to explore ideas about the origin of the cosmos, the nature of change, and the structure of reality itself. This did not replace religion, but it introduced a parallel way of understanding the world. Myth explained meaning. Philosophy began to search for mechanism. And both existed at the same time. This coexistence of myth and reason became one of the defining features of Greek civilization. It allowed the Greeks to preserve their religious traditions while also developing some of the earliest foundations of scientific and philosophical thought in human history. As Athens and Sparta continued to evolve, their differences would eventually come into direct conflict with external pressures that threatened the entire Greek world. Because no matter how strong individual city-states became, they still existed in a fragmented system. And fragmented systems, no matter how culturally rich, are vulnerable when confronted by large centralized powers beyond their borders. That confrontation was approaching, and it would force Greece to either unite under pressure or face consequences that would reshape its entire history. By the time Greece had fully entered its classical period, the world beyond the Aegean was changing in ways that the Greek city-states could no longer ignore. To the east, a vast and highly organized empire had risen, one that operated on a scale far beyond anything the fragmented Greek polis had ever experienced. This was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a civilization built on centralized authority, imperial administration, and the ability to project power across immense distances. For the Greeks, who were used to political independence and localized decision-making, this new reality represented something fundamentally different. The Persians did not see the world as a collection of equal city-states. They saw it as a unified imperial system under a single ruler, the Great King, whose authority extended across regions, cultures, and peoples. And as Persian influence expanded westward into Anatolia, contact with the Greek world became inevitable. Initially, this contact was not purely hostile. Many Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor were incorporated into the Persian system, often maintaining a degree of local autonomy in exchange for tribute and political submission. For some city-states, Persian rule meant stability and access to broader trade networks. For others, it meant loss of independence and increasing tension. But beneath this uneasy balance, pressure was building. Greek identity, shaped by independence and competition among city-states, did not easily align with imperial control from a distant authority. The idea of submitting to a single centralized ruler conflicted with the deeply embedded political culture of the polis system. Even though Greeks were divided among themselves, they still shared a strong sense that freedom from external domination was a defining feature of their identity. That tension eventually erupted in what became known as the Ionian Revolt. Greek cities in Asia Minor, dissatisfied with Persian control, began to rebel. They sought support from mainland Greek city-states, particularly Athens, which provided limited assistance. Although the revolt was ultimately suppressed, it marked a turning point. It brought Greece and Persia into direct conflict on a larger scale. And once that conflict began, it could no longer remain localized. The Persian Empire, under its rulers, began to prepare for full-scale invasions of mainland Greece. From the Persian perspective, these campaigns were not just punitive expeditions. They were attempts to stabilize frontier regions and assert imperial authority over areas that had resisted integration. For the Greeks, however, the situation was interpreted very differently. It was seen as an existential threat, a confrontation between independence and empire, between fragmentation and centralization, between two fundamentally different political worlds. The first major Persian invasion came under King Darius I. His forces crossed into Greek territory, aiming to punish rebellious cities and assert control over the region. It was during this campaign that one of the most famous battles in Greek history took place. The Battle of Marathon. On one side stood the Persian forces, numerically superior and representing a vast imperial system. On the other side stood the Athenians, supported by a small contingent from Plataea, defending their homeland with limited resources but strong motivation. Against expectations shaped by sheer size and power imbalance, the Greek forces achieved a decisive victory. The battle became a symbol of resistance, suggesting that organized citizen soldiers fighting for their own city could successfully oppose even the largest imperial armies. But Marathon was not the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger confrontation. Years later, a second and far more massive invasion was launched by Xerxes I, the successor of Darius. This campaign was designed not just to punish resistance, but to fully subdue the Greek mainland and bring it under Persian control. The scale of this invasion was unprecedented in Greek experience. Land forces moved through the north, while naval forces supported the campaign along the coast. City-states were forced to make urgent decisions, submit, resist, or attempt neutrality. Some chose submission, others attempted resistance, and a few formed alliances in response to the overwhelming threat. It was in this context that one of the most famous moments in Greek history occurred. The stand at Thermopylae. A small Greek force, led by Spartan King Leonidas, positioned itself at a narrow mountain pass, using geography to offset numerical disadvantage. For a brief moment, this location became a symbolic barrier between Persia and the Greek mainland. The battle itself ended in defeat for the Greeks, but its significance extended far beyond the outcome. It became a story of sacrifice, resistance, and the idea that courage could exist even in the face of certain destruction. At the same time, the Greek naval forces were preparing for a decisive confrontation at sea. Because while land battles shaped the narrative of heroism, control of the sea would determine the strategic outcome of the war. That confrontation would take place at Salamis, and it would change the course of Greek history permanently. But before that moment, Greece stood at a crossroads. City-states that had spent centuries competing with each other were now forced to confront a larger question. Could they remain divided in the face of external pressure? Or would survival require a level of unity they had never achieved before? The answer to that question would define not just the outcome of the Persian Wars, but the entire future of Greek civilization. The Persian advance into Greece did not move like a single unstoppable wave, but it carried the weight of an empire that had already absorbed countless kingdoms, cultures, and armies. For the Greeks, however, the scale of the invasion felt absolute. It was not just another war between city-states or regional rivals. It was a confrontation with something fundamentally larger than anything the Greek world had ever faced. And in that moment, something unusual began to happen. The fragmented Greek world started to behave like a single strategic body. Not fully unified, not politically merged, but coordinated under pressure in a way it had never achieved before. Some city-states chose submission, calculating that survival under Persian rule was preferable to destruction. Others prepared for resistance, driven by pride, ideology, or the belief that Greek freedom itself was at stake. And a smaller but crucial group formed alliances to coordinate military defense across regions that had rarely acted together in history. This was not unity by design. It was unity by necessity. After the early clashes and the symbolic stand at Thermopylae, the Persian forces continued their advance deeper into Greek territory. Athens itself faced imminent danger. The population was evacuated, the city abandoned temporarily, and its fate left uncertain as the war shifted toward a decisive naval confrontation. Because by this stage, the true balance of power was no longer determined solely on land. It was at sea, and that is where the conflict reached its turning point. The Battle of Salamis became one of the most decisive naval engagements in ancient history. The Greek fleet, though smaller, was more familiar with the narrow straits and coastal geography of the region. The Persian fleet, larger and more diverse, struggled to maneuver effectively in confined waters. What followed was not just a battle of ships, but a battle of strategy, timing, and environmental awareness. And in that confined space, the Greek advantage became decisive. The Persian fleet was drawn into conditions that reduced its numerical superiority, allowing the Greek triremes to strike with precision and coordination. The result was a collapse of Persian naval effectiveness, forcing a strategic withdrawal and shifting the momentum of the entire war. In that moment, the Persian advance into Greece was halted. Not erased, but stopped. And that distinction mattered. Because empires rarely fail through total destruction. They fail through the limits of expansion meeting resistance they cannot fully overcome. After Salamis, the war continued, but the strategic direction had changed. The following year saw the decisive land engagement at Plataea, where Greek forces once again managed to coordinate effectively against Persian armies on Greek soil. This battle marked the end of large-scale Persian attempts to conquer mainland Greece. And with it, the immediate existential threat to Greek independence was removed. But the consequences of the war extended far beyond military victory. Because victory created something else. Confidence. The sense that the Greek world had not only survived, but proven itself capable of resisting one of the largest empires in the known world. This perception reshaped Greek identity in profound ways. The idea that freedom, even in fragmented form, could withstand centralized imperial power became a foundational narrative. Athens, in particular, emerged from the Persian Wars in a position of increased influence. Its naval power had been essential in the victory at Salamis, and this gave it a new level of prestige among Greek city-states. Over time, this influence would be organized into a political and military alliance system known as the Delian League, initially formed as a defensive coalition against future Persian threats. But alliances in the Greek world were rarely static, and what begins as cooperation can evolve into control. At the same time, Sparta also maintained its status as a dominant land power, respected for its military discipline and leadership during the war. The balance between Athens and Sparta had not been resolved by the Persian Wars. If anything, it had been intensified. Because now both cities had proven their effectiveness in different domains. Sparta on land, Athens at sea, and both now carried the prestige of having helped preserve Greek independence. Meanwhile, Greek culture itself began to transform in the aftermath of victory. The Persian Wars became more than historical events. They became symbolic foundations for art, literature, and civic identity. Plays, poetry, and public discourse began to reflect themes of freedom, resistance, and human agency in the face of overwhelming force. Religion also played a subtle but important role in interpreting the outcome of the war. Many Greeks saw victory as evidence of divine favor, a sign that the gods had supported their cause. Temples were built, offerings were made, and religious festivals increasingly incorporated themes of collective identity and shared triumph. But beneath this sense of unity, deeper structural changes were unfolding. Because war does not just end conflict, it changes systems. Athens began to expand its influence over allied city-states through the Delian League, gradually transforming what had begun as a defensive alliance into a network increasingly centered around Athenian leadership. Tribute payments, naval contributions, and political alignment began to reflect a shift in power dynamics. What had once been cooperation slowly began to resemble hierarchy. And Sparta, observing this growing influence, remained cautious. The Greek world had survived external conquest, but now it was entering a new phase of internal competition. A phase where the greatest threats would no longer come from outside empires, but from within its own civilization. Because once external pressure is removed, internal differences become more visible. And Greece, for all its cultural unity, remained politically fragmented. That fragmentation was about to become the defining force of the next era. An era of prosperity, innovation, and eventually, self-destruction through war between its greatest powers. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, Athens entered a period that would later be remembered as one of the most extraordinary cultural and intellectual explosions in human history. The city had been burned, evacuated, and rebuilt, but what emerged from that destruction was not simply a restored polis. It was something larger in ambition, confidence, and influence than anything Athens had been before. Victory against Persia had changed everything. Not just militarily, but psychologically. Athens no longer saw itself as just one city among many. It saw itself as a leader. And that belief would reshape the entire Greek world. Under the leadership of figures like Pericles, Athens began to transform its political and cultural identity. The Delian League, originally created as a defensive alliance against Persian aggression, gradually evolved into a system of Athenian dominance over allied city-states. Tribute flowed into Athens, naval power expanded, and influence spread across the Aegean. And with that power came resources. Resources that would be used not only for war, but for construction, art, philosophy, and civic development. Athens was becoming something new. A cultural capital, a political experiment, and an intellectual center. The city itself was rebuilt with unprecedented ambition. Monumental architecture rose across the Acropolis, most famously the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athene, the city's patron goddess. This structure was not just religious, it was symbolic. It represented order, beauty, power, and the belief that human civilization could express harmony through design and proportion. But Athens was not only building temples, it was building ideas. This was the period when democracy in Athens reached its most developed form. While still limited by modern standards, participation in governance expanded among male citizens, allowing direct involvement in decision-making through assemblies and councils. Political debate became a defining feature of civic life. Speaking ability, persuasion, and argumentation became essential skills for influence. In Athens, power was not only exercised through force, it was exercised through speech. And that shift changed everything about how society functioned. At the same time, theater emerged as one of the most important cultural institutions in Athens. Tragedy and comedy were not simply entertainment. They were public explorations of moral conflict, political tension, divine influence, and human limitation. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides used mythological and historical themes to examine questions that still resonate today. Fate versus free will, justice versus power, and the consequences of human ambition. These performances were not private events. They were civic rituals, performed in large open-air theaters where thousands of citizens gathered to witness stories that reflected their collective identity. And beneath all of this cultural expansion, philosophy was beginning to take a more defined shape. Thinkers like Socrates challenged assumptions about knowledge, morality, and human understanding. Instead of relying solely on tradition or mythological explanation, they began to ask questions about how people know what they claim to know. Dialogue, questioning, and critical examination became tools for exploring truth. This marked a subtle but profound shift in Greek intellectual life. Myth had explained the world through story. Religion had explained it through divine presence. Philosophy now began to examine it through reasoned inquiry. But these systems did not replace each other. They coexisted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. Athens in this period became a place where all of these forces intersected at once: democracy, religion, art, philosophy, and imperial influence. It was a city where public life was intensely active, where citizens engaged in constant debate about law, war, culture, and identity. And yet, this golden age contained within it the seeds of its own instability. Because power concentrated in Athens created resentment among other city-states, especially Sparta and its allies. The transformation of the Delian League into what increasingly looked like an Athenian empire created tension that could no longer be ignored. What had begun as cooperation after a shared war was now becoming competition between former allies. And in a system where no single authority governed all of Greece, there was no mechanism to fully resolve that tension. Diplomacy could delay conflict, but not eliminate it. Sparta watched Athens expand its influence with increasing concern. Its own system, built on military discipline and internal stability, contrasted sharply with Athens' naval expansion and democratic experimentation. The balance of power that had briefly existed after the Persian Wars was slowly breaking down. And as suspicion grew between the two dominant powers of Greece, alliances began to shift across the wider Greek world. City-states aligned themselves based on security concerns, economic interests, and ideological preferences. The Greek world was no longer unified by external threat. It was dividing along internal lines. Two systems, two powers, two visions of Greek civilization. One focused on maritime dominance, democracy, and cultural expansion. The other focused on land power, discipline, and controlled stability. And between them stood a network of smaller city-states forced to choose sides in a growing rivalry. This was not yet war, but it was the structure of war forming beneath the surface. And once that structure is in place, conflict becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. The golden age of Athens was therefore not just a peak of cultural achievement. It was also the beginning of a turning point. Because beneath the art, philosophy, and architecture, the political foundations of Greece were beginning to fracture in ways that would soon become impossible to contain. The tension that had been building between Athens and Sparta did not erupt all at once. It accumulated slowly through decades of mistrust, competing alliances, and small conflicts that gradually revealed how fragile the post-Persian War balance had become. Greece, even after surviving a massive external invasion, had never solved its internal contradiction. It remained culturally unified, but politically fragmented. And that fragmentation was now turning into open hostility. Athens had grown powerful through its naval dominance and its leadership of what had once been the Delian League. Over time, this alliance system had shifted away from mutual defense and toward Athenian control. Tribute from allied city-states flowed into Athens, strengthening its economy, funding its fleet, and fueling its cultural expansion. From Athens' perspective, this system ensured security and stability in the Aegean. But from the perspective of many other Greek city-states, especially Sparta and its allies, it looked increasingly like an empire in all but name. Sparta had not expanded in the same way. Its power was rooted in land warfare, internal discipline, and a tightly controlled social system. It did not rely on maritime trade or widespread alliances in the same manner as Athens. Instead, it maintained influence through its military reputation and its leadership of the Peloponnesian League. Two systems now stood in direct contrast. One maritime, democratic, and expansionist in influence. One land-based, oligarchic, and stability-focused. And between them, the rest of Greece was slowly being pulled apart. The breaking point came when smaller disputes between allied city-states escalated into wider confrontations, drawing in both Athens and Sparta as guarantors of their respective alliances. What might once have remained localized conflicts now became entangled in the broader rivalry between the two great powers. And once that happened, escalation became difficult to stop. War between Athens and Sparta did not begin as a single decisive declaration. It began as a series of engagements, diplomatic breakdowns, and retaliatory actions that gradually expanded until almost the entire Greek world was involved. City-states were forced to choose sides, and neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain. This was the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict not against an external empire, but within the Greek world itself. And that fact alone made it fundamentally different from the Persian Wars. This was not survival against invasion. It was a struggle for dominance within a shared civilization. The war unfolded over many years, shifting between phases of intensity and exhaustion. At times, Sparta would dominate land campaigns, leveraging its superior infantry and disciplined military structure. At other times, Athens would rely on its naval strength to maintain supply lines, project power across the Aegean, and resist Spartan pressure. Warfare in this period was not limited to battlefield encounters alone. It also involved economic strain, political instability, and psychological pressure on civilian populations. Athens, in particular, faced severe internal challenges as its population concentrated within city walls for protection. During one of these periods, a devastating plague struck the city, killing a significant portion of its population and weakening its political and military capacity. Among the dead was Pericles, the leader who had guided Athens during much of its golden age. His death marked a symbolic turning point. Because leadership matters deeply in prolonged conflicts, and Athens now faced increasing internal division about how the war should be conducted. More aggressive strategies, more cautious approaches, and shifting political leadership created instability within the city itself. At the same time, Sparta adapted its strategy. Rather than attempting to directly conquer Athens through prolonged land siege, it focused on weakening Athenian resources, disrupting its alliances, and building its own naval capabilities with external support. The war became increasingly complex, involving not just two powers, but a network of shifting alliances, betrayals, and changing loyalties across the Greek world. And beneath all of this, the structure of Greek civilization itself was being tested. Because the war was not just military, it was systemic. It exposed the limitations of a world built on independent city-states without centralized authority. Coordination became difficult, long-term strategy was undermined by local interests, and trust between former allies deteriorated under the pressure of prolonged conflict. Even cultural identity began to fracture. Greeks were fighting Greeks, using shared language, shared religion, and shared traditions against one another. The very unity that had helped resist Persia now became a background feature of a civil conflict that no external enemy had created. As the war progressed, Athens suffered a major strategic disaster during an ambitious expedition to Sicily. Seeking to expand its influence further, Athens launched a large-scale military campaign that ultimately ended in catastrophic defeat. The loss of ships, soldiers, and resources severely weakened Athenian power and marked a turning point in the war. From that point onward, the balance began to shift decisively in Sparta's favor. With Persian financial support and growing naval capability, Sparta was able to challenge Athens more effectively at sea while maintaining pressure on land. Athenian resources dwindled, its alliances weakened, and internal political cohesion continued to erode. Eventually, after years of exhaustion, blockade, and internal collapse, Athens was forced into surrender. The city that had once represented the height of Greek cultural achievement, political innovation, and intellectual life was now defeated. But this was not the end of Greece. It was the end of its classical balance. Because after the Peloponnesian War, no city-state was strong enough to restore full stability to the Greek world. Sparta emerged as the dominant military power, but it lacked the economic and administrative capacity to fully unify Greece. Athens retained cultural influence but lost political dominance. The rest of the Greek world remained fragmented and increasingly unstable. And in this weakened condition, Greece entered a new phase. One defined not by internal rivalry alone, but by vulnerability to external forces that had been watching from the margins. Because when a system exhausts itself through internal conflict, it becomes vulnerable to something new rising in its place. And that new force was already forming in the north. After the Peloponnesian War ended, Greece did not experience peace in the way people often imagine after a major conflict. Instead, it entered a period of exhaustion, instability, and constant realignment. The war had not unified Greece under a single victor. It had simply weakened everyone involved. Athens was defeated, its empire dismantled, its navy reduced, and its political confidence shattered. Sparta, although victorious, now found itself in an uncomfortable position. It had won a war that demanded long-term control, but it lacked the economic structure, administrative reach, and maritime capability to fully govern the Greek world it now influenced. Victory had not created stability. It had created imbalance. Sparta attempted to impose order through military garrisons and appointed governors in various cities, but this approach often generated resentment. The very system that had made Sparta powerful, its rigid military discipline and inward-focused social structure, was not suited for managing a wide and diverse network of independent polis. At the same time, former Athenian allies who had suffered under the war and its aftermath were reluctant to accept Spartan dominance. The result was a Greek world filled with shifting alliances, short-lived coalitions, and repeated outbreaks of local conflict. Instead of one large war ending and peace beginning, Greece entered a cycle of smaller wars within a weakened system. And this cycle exposed a deeper structural problem. The Greek world had no mechanism for sustained unity, no central authority, no enduring federation capable of enforcing long-term stability across all city-states. Everything depended on temporary balance between competing powers. And once that balance was disrupted, instability returned. Sparta's dominance began to face challenges from within Greece itself. One of the most significant came from Thebes, a city that rose in military prominence and briefly challenged Spartan supremacy. This shift showed that even after decades of warfare, no single Greek city-state could permanently dominate the others. Power shifted too easily. Control was too fragile. And loyalty too conditional. Meanwhile, Athens slowly began to recover, not as a dominant military power, but as a cultural and intellectual center. Its philosophical schools, artistic traditions, and educational systems continued to influence the wider Greek world, even in defeat. Athens retained something Sparta could not fully replicate: cultural prestige. This division between military power and cultural influence became one of the defining features of post-war Greece. But beneath these political struggles, another transformation was unfolding. Economic pressure was increasing across many city-states. War had disrupted trade networks, damaged infrastructure, and strained agricultural production. Populations in some regions began to shift, and mercenary warfare became more common as citizens could no longer always rely on traditional civic military systems. The idea of the citizen soldier, so central to earlier Greek warfare, began to weaken. And in its place, more professionalized and paid military forces started to emerge. This change subtly altered the relationship between citizens and their city-states. Because when warfare is no longer tied directly to citizenship, political identity begins to shift as well. At the same time, intellectual life in Greece continued to develop in new directions. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and later Aristotle emerged during or shortly after this period of instability. Their work was deeply influenced by the political and moral crises of their time. Socrates, in particular, challenged assumptions about knowledge, ethics, and civic responsibility. Through questioning and dialogue, he exposed contradictions in commonly held beliefs, encouraging people to think critically about justice, virtue, and the nature of a good life. Plato, his student, expanded these ideas into broader philosophical systems, exploring questions of ideal forms, governance, and reality itself. Aristotle later built on this tradition by focusing more systematically on observation, classification, and logic. What is important here is not just the development of philosophy itself, but the context in which it developed. Greek philosophy did not emerge in isolation. It emerged in a world of political instability, cultural tension, and shifting power structures. In a sense, philosophy became a response to crisis, a way of searching for order in a world that had lost political stability. Meanwhile, religious and cultural traditions continued to operate as a stabilizing force across Greek society. The Olympian gods still played a central role in civic identity, festivals, and moral interpretation. Even as philosophical reasoning expanded, mythology remained deeply embedded in daily life. These systems did not cancel each other out. They coexisted. Myth explained meaning. Philosophy examined structure. Religion maintained continuity. And politics struggled to maintain control. But despite this rich cultural landscape, the political reality remained unstable. City-states were too independent to unify permanently, too competitive to remain peaceful, and too weakened by prolonged warfare to sustain long-term dominance. Greece had entered a structural crisis. A system designed around fragmentation was now exposed to its own limitations. And into this environment, external forces began to take notice. Because history rarely remains isolated for long. When internal systems weaken, external systems often become stronger. And in the north, a kingdom was rising that would soon change everything. A kingdom that would not operate like a traditional Greek city-state, but like a centralized state with ambitions that extended far beyond Greece itself. That kingdom was Macedon, and it was preparing to reshape the Greek world permanently. While the southern Greek city-states remained locked in cycles of rivalry, instability, and short-lived alliances, a different kind of power was steadily rising in the north. Macedonia was not initially seen by the southern Greeks as equal to their own civilizations. To many Athenians and Spartans, it appeared semi-peripheral, less culturally refined, and politically less sophisticated than the great polis of the south. But this perception would prove dangerously misleading. Because Macedonia was developing along a fundamentally different path. Unlike the fragmented city-states of southern Greece, Macedonia was moving towards centralized monarchy. Power was not distributed among competing civic institutions or shifting alliances. It was concentrated in the hands of a king, supported by a loyal aristocracy and a rapidly evolving military structure. And under King Philip II, Macedonia transformed from a loosely organized kingdom into one of the most efficient military states in the ancient world. Philip's rise was not simply a matter of inheritance. It was the result of deliberate reform, strategic calculation, and ruthless political consolidation. When he came to power, Macedonia was vulnerable, surrounded by stronger Greek city-states and external threats. But instead of trying to imitate the fragmented systems of the south, Philip restructured his kingdom from within. He strengthened royal authority, reorganized the army, and introduced military innovations that would change warfare in Greece forever. The most important of these was the refinement of the Macedonian phalanx. While Greek city-states had long used hoplite formations, Philip expanded and systematized the phalanx into a more flexible and longer-reaching formation. Macedonian infantry were equipped with longer spears, allowing them to engage enemies at greater distance while maintaining tight formation control. Combined with cavalry units and coordinated battlefield tactics, this created a highly adaptable military system capable of overpowering traditional hoplite armies. But military innovation alone was not enough. Philip also used diplomacy, alliances, and strategic marriages to gradually extend Macedonian influence over surrounding regions. Some Greek city-states were absorbed through negotiation, others through coercion, and others through military pressure. Over time, Macedonia's influence expanded southward, slowly tightening its grip on the fragmented Greek world. And as this expansion continued, the southern city-states found themselves increasingly unable to respond effectively. Because they were still operating within an older system of rivalry, distrust, and short-term alliances. Macedonia was operating on a different scale. A centralized state competing against fragmented ones has a structural advantage that is difficult to overcome without unity. And Greece had never achieved lasting unity. Even after centuries of shared culture, religion, and language, political division remained the dominant feature of the Greek world. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and other city-states each had their own interests, their own fears, and their own histories of conflict with one another. Attempts at coalition were fragile and temporary, trust was limited, cooperation was conditional. Philip understood this weakness, and he exploited it carefully. He positioned himself not only as a military power, but as a unifying force for the Greek world, framing Macedonian leadership as a solution to endless internal conflict. Through a combination of diplomacy and force, he gradually extended influence into southern Greece. Key moments of resistance did occur. Some city-states attempted to oppose Macedonian expansion, forming coalitions to preserve independence, but these efforts were often undermined by internal disagreements and lack of sustained coordination. The decisive confrontation came at Chaeronea, where Macedonian forces defeated a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes. This battle marked a turning point in Greek history. It was not just a military defeat for individual cities. It was the effective end of independent Greek political autonomy on a large scale. After Chaeronea, Philip established the Corinthian League, a federation of Greek city-states under Macedonian leadership. While the League preserved a degree of local autonomy, real power now rested with Macedon. For the first time in centuries, much of Greece was politically unified under a single authority. But Philip's ambitions extended beyond Greece itself. He was preparing for a larger campaign against Persia, the same empire that had once invaded Greece generations earlier. In a sense, history was preparing to reverse itself. Instead of Persia invading Greece, Greece under Macedonian leadership would invade Persia. However, Philip would not live to see this campaign fully realized. He was assassinated before the invasion could begin, and the responsibility for this new phase of history would fall to his son, Alexander, a figure who would take the Macedonian system, expand it far beyond anything previously imagined, and reshape the ancient world in a way that still echoes through history today. Because under Alexander, Macedonia would stop being just a regional power. It would become the center of a vast imperial expansion that would stretch from Greece to the edges of India. And with that transformation, the Greek world would enter its most expansive and culturally transformative phase yet. Not as isolated city-states, not even as a unified kingdom, but as the foundation of a globalizing empire driven by conquest, culture, and the spread of Greek identity across continents. When Alexander inherited the throne of Macedon, he did not simply inherit a kingdom. He inherited a system already reshaping the Greek world, an army already capable of dominating the fractured city-states, and a political position that placed him at the center of a newly unified Greece under Macedonian authority. But Alexander was not content with consolidation. He was driven by something larger, something that would push the boundaries of the known world. From the beginning of his reign, Alexander carried with him both the military foundation built by Philip II and an intense personal ambition shaped by education, myth, and ideology. He had been taught by Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers of the Greek world, who exposed him to ideas about logic, politics, nature, ethics, and the structure of knowledge itself. But alongside philosophy, Alexander was also deeply influenced by heroic tradition. He saw himself not only as a king, but as a figure within a mythic narrative, a successor to Achilles, a conqueror destined to rival the heroes of legend. And in that mindset, the Persian Empire was not just a political opponent. It was the ultimate challenge, a continuation of the unfinished conflict from earlier Greek history. The invasion of Persia began as a carefully structured campaign, but it quickly became something much larger. Alexander moved with speed, precision, and relentless momentum, using the Macedonian military system to defeat Persian forces in a series of decisive battles. One of the most significant early confrontations occurred at the Granicus River, where Alexander's forces crossed into Asia Minor and defeated Persian satrapal armies. This victory opened the path deeper into Persian-controlled territories and demonstrated that the Macedonian military system was capable of defeating even established imperial forces in direct engagement. From there, Alexander advanced rapidly through Asia Minor, securing cities, consolidating control, and integrating regions into his expanding campaign. Some cities surrendered, others resisted, but the momentum of his advance continued to grow. The Persian Empire, vast and complex, began to respond more directly under its king, Darius III. The confrontation between Alexander and Darius represented more than a military clash. It symbolized the meeting of two different models of power, one decentralized but expansive through administration, the other centralized but dynamically driven by military conquest. The decisive battle between them occurred at Issus. Here Alexander faced a larger Persian force under Darius himself. Despite numerical disadvantage, the Macedonian army once again demonstrated superior coordination, tactical flexibility, and leadership. The Persian forces were defeated, and Darius was forced to flee, leaving behind his family and royal entourage. This moment had profound symbolic importance. It was not just a battlefield victory. It was a psychological collapse of Persian imperial authority in the eyes of many contemporaries. From Issus, Alexander continued his campaign southward, moving through the Levant and into Egypt. Unlike many of the regions he encountered, Egypt did not resist strongly. Instead, Alexander was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. In Egypt, he was even declared a pharaoh, integrating himself into local religious and political structures. This ability to adopt and adapt to local systems became one of Alexander's defining characteristics. He did not only conquer, he incorporated. And in doing so, he began a process that historians later call Hellenization. Greek language, culture, political ideas, and artistic forms began to spread across the territories he controlled. But this was not a one-way imposition, it was a fusion. Local traditions also influenced Greek practices, creating hybrid cultural systems across the expanding empire. After Egypt, Alexander turned eastward once again toward the heart of the Persian Empire. The final and most decisive confrontation came at Gaugamela. Here Darius assembled a massive army in a final attempt to stop Alexander's advance. The scale of the Persian forces was enormous, representing the full weight of imperial military power. Yet once again, Alexander's tactical leadership and the flexibility of the Macedonian army proved decisive. The Persian forces were defeated. Darius fled once more, and the Persian Empire effectively collapsed as a unified political structure. But Alexander did not stop there. Instead of consolidating and returning, he continued deeper into former Persian territories, capturing major cities such as Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. These cities were not merely conquered. They were integrated into a new imperial framework that now stretched across vast regions of the ancient world. At this stage, Alexander's empire was no longer simply Macedonian or Greek. It was becoming something unprecedented. A transcontinental system of rule connected by military control, administrative adaptation, and cultural integration. But even this was not the end of his ambition. Alexander continued further east, eventually reaching regions that brought him into contact with the Indian subcontinent. Here, his armies encountered new political systems, new military formations, and new cultural traditions that stretched the limits of their experience. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced King Porus, whose forces included war elephants, a feature unfamiliar and initially challenging for the Macedonian army. Despite this, Alexander once again achieved victory through tactical adaptation and battlefield coordination. But this campaign marked a turning point. Because after years of continuous expansion, Alexander's army began to resist further eastward movement. They had reached the limits of their endurance, exhausted by constant warfare and unfamiliar terrain. For the first time, Alexander was forced to halt his expansion. and soon after, he began to turn back. But he would never complete that return journey. Alexander died unexpectedly at the age of 32, leaving behind an empire that stretched across 3 continents but lacked a clear system of succession. And with his death, the unified structure he had created began to fracture almost immediately. Not into chaos, but into successor kingdoms, each claiming a portion of his empire, each carrying fragments of Greek political and cultural identity into new regions. And from this fragmentation, a new historical era began. An era not of conquest alone, but of cultural diffusion on a scale the Greek world had never experienced before. When Alexander died, the shock across his empire was not simply emotional, it was structural. He had built a system that stretched across continents, held together largely by his authority, his military momentum, and the shared identity of conquest. But there was no clear, universally accepted mechanism to replace him. So the empire did what large, rapidly expanded systems often do when the center disappears. It fragmented, but it did not collapse into silence or obscurity. Instead, it reorganized into successor kingdoms. And from this fragmentation emerged one of the most culturally dynamic periods in ancient history, the Hellenistic world. The generals and administrators who had served under Alexander divided his empire into regions, each ruled independently but still shaped by the Greek military, administrative, and cultural systems that had expanded during his campaigns. 3 major power centers emerged most prominently. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom took root. In Mesopotamia and Persia, the Seleucid Empire formed. And in Greece and Macedonia itself, the Antigonid dynasty maintained control over the original homeland. These were not isolated kingdoms. They were interconnected parts of a wider cultural system. And what unified them was not political unity, but cultural diffusion. Greek language, institutions, art, and philosophical traditions became dominant across these regions, blending with local customs, religions, and administrative systems. This process is what historians call Hellenization, but it is important to understand it not as simple cultural replacement, but as cultural fusion. In Egypt, for example, Greek rulers adopted elements of Egyptian kingship traditions while also promoting Greek language and governance structures. Cities like Alexandria became major centers of learning, trade, and intellectual activity. The famous Library of Alexandria symbolized this new era of knowledge, where scholars attempted to collect and organize the intellectual achievements of the known world. Science, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy flourished in ways that were deeply connected to earlier Greek intellectual traditions, but expanded through contact with Egyptian, Babylonian, and other Near Eastern knowledge systems. In the Seleucid territories, Greek administrative systems coexisted with long-established Persian and Mesopotamian traditions. This created layered political structures where Greek elites often governed diverse populations with deeply rooted local cultures. Meanwhile, in Greece itself, the old city-state system never fully returned. Instead, Greece became part of a larger geopolitical network where Macedonian influence remained significant, but no single city-state regained its former independence or dominance. What emerged across the Hellenistic world was a new kind of civilization. Not a unified empire in the traditional sense, but a shared cultural sphere. Greek became a common language of administration, trade, and intellectual exchange. Cities across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East shared architectural styles, artistic motifs, and philosophical ideas. At the same time, local traditions remained strong, producing hybrid identities that combined Greek and indigenous elements. Religion also transformed during this period. Traditional Greek gods continued to be worshipped, but they increasingly coexisted with local deities and new religious interpretations. In some cases, gods were blended together through syncretism, where Greek and foreign deities were identified with one another based on shared attributes. This created a religious landscape that was highly flexible and regionally diverse, yet still connected through shared cultural frameworks. Philosophy also evolved significantly in this era. Schools such as Stoicism and Epicureanism emerged, offering different approaches to understanding human life, ethics, and the nature of the universe. Stoicism emphasized rational order, self-control, and acceptance of fate within a structured cosmos. Epicureanism focused on pleasure, moderation, and the avoidance of unnecessary fear, particularly fear rooted in superstition and divine punishment. These philosophies reflected the broader Hellenistic experience, a world no longer centered on small city-states, a world no longer defined by local political participation, but a world of larger, more complex systems where individuals had to find meaning in environments that were far more expansive and less personally controlled. At the same time, Hellenistic kingdoms engaged in constant political competition. Wars between successor states were frequent as rulers sought to expand or defend their territories. Yet despite this conflict, cultural exchange continued because all these states still operated within the same broadly Hellenistic framework. Trade routes expanded dramatically, connecting the Mediterranean to Central Asia and beyond. Goods, ideas, and people moved across regions with unprecedented scale. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon became major hubs of knowledge, commerce, and cultural production. But even as this world flourished, it carried within it a structural weakness. It was divided, not culturally, but politically. And that division created opportunities for new powers to emerge. In the West, another rising force was expanding rapidly. Rome. At first, it existed outside the Hellenistic system, but over time, it would come into increasing contact with Greek kingdoms. And unlike earlier interactions with Persia or Macedon, Rome would not simply be another regional competitor. It would eventually absorb the Hellenistic world entirely. But even as Roman power began to rise, Greek culture did not disappear. Instead, it transformed again. Because Greek ideas had already spread too deeply, too widely, and too fundamentally into the structure of Mediterranean civilization to be erased. And so, instead of ending, Greek civilization entered a new phase. One where it would live inside another empire and reshape it from within. By the time Rome began expanding into the eastern Mediterranean, the Greek world was no longer a collection of independent city-states, nor even a unified Hellenistic empire. It was something more complex, more diffuse, and in many ways more influential than ever before. Greek culture had become embedded across the entire eastern Mediterranean world. Language, philosophy, art, education, and political administration in many regions still operated through Greek frameworks. Even where political control belonged to other powers, Greek intellectual life remained deeply present. In many cities, especially in the eastern provinces, Greek was the language of learning, commerce, and governance. So when Rome encountered the Greek world, it did not encounter a civilization waiting to be replaced. It encountered a civilization already deeply established within the structures of the ancient world. Rome's expansion into Greek territories did not begin as a single conquest, but as a gradual process of military intervention, alliances, and political absorption. As Roman power grew in the West, it increasingly turned its attention eastward, engaging with the fragmented successor kingdoms of the Hellenistic era. One by one, these kingdoms came under Roman control. Macedonia was defeated and reorganized. Greek mainland territories were brought under Roman administration. The Seleucid and Ptolemaic realms eventually fell into Roman dominance as well. But something unusual happened during this process. Instead of being erased, Greek culture was absorbed. Roman elites did not reject Greek intellectual traditions. On the contrary, they adopted them extensively. Greek philosophy became central to Roman education. Greek literature was studied by Roman aristocrats. Greek art, architecture, and scientific thought influenced Roman development at almost every level. In many ways, Rome did not replace Greece. It inherited it and transformed it into something broader. A Greco-Roman cultural world emerged, where Roman political authority coexisted with Greek intellectual dominance, especially in the eastern provinces. This cultural integration had long-term consequences. Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle continued to influence Roman thinkers. Stoicism, which had developed in the Hellenistic period, became especially important in Roman intellectual life, shaping ideas about duty, discipline, and the structure of the cosmos. At the same time, the Eastern Greek-speaking regions of the Roman Empire retained a strong sense of cultural continuity with their Hellenistic past. Cities in Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Levant continued to function as centers of Greek learning and administration. But the most significant transformation during this period was not only cultural. It was religious. Within the Eastern Roman world, new religious movements began to emerge and spread, including early Christianity. This new faith initially developed within a predominantly Greek-speaking environment, and many of its foundational texts were written in Greek. As a result, Greek language and intellectual frameworks played a major role in shaping early Christian theology, philosophy, and organizational structure. Over time, Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, eventually becoming one of its dominant religious systems. This marked a profound shift in the religious landscape of the Mediterranean world, as older polytheistic traditions gradually declined or transformed into new forms. Yet even as religious systems changed, Greek intellectual traditions did not disappear. Instead, they were preserved, studied, and transmitted through new institutions, including Christian theological schools and later Byzantine scholarship. When the Western Roman Empire eventually fell, the eastern half of the empire continued. This eastern continuation is what modern historians refer to as the Byzantine Empire, although its inhabitants simply considered themselves Romans. However, culturally and linguistically, this Eastern Empire was heavily Greek in character. Greek became the dominant language of administration and intellectual life. Greek philosophy, literature, and scientific thought continued to be studied and preserved. Greek Orthodox Christianity became a defining feature of the empire's religious identity. In this sense, Greek civilization did not end with the fall of classical Greece. It evolved, it transformed, and it continued within a new imperial structure that preserved many aspects of its intellectual heritage. One of the most important contributions of this Byzantine Greek world was the preservation of ancient texts. Philosophical works, historical accounts, scientific treatises, and literary masterpieces from classical Greece were copied, studied, and transmitted across centuries. Without this process of preservation, much of what is known about ancient Greek civilization today would have been lost. And so Greek civilization, in its final historical phase, became a bridge, connecting the ancient world to the medieval and eventually modern worlds. When Constantinople fell in 1453, it marked the end of the Byzantine Empire. But even this event did not erase Greek influence. Greek scholars, fleeing westward, carried manuscripts and knowledge into Renaissance Europe, contributing to the revival of classical learning. This transmission helped shape the foundations of modern Western philosophy, science, politics, and literature. The ideas of democracy, rational inquiry, philosophical ethics, and dramatic storytelling all trace significant roots back to Greek civilization. Even mythology, once the explanatory system of the ancient world, continues to influence literature, psychology, and cultural imagination today. So when looking at the entire history of Greece, what emerges is not the story of a single empire rising and falling. It is the story of a civilization that constantly transformed itself across different political forms, from Bronze Age palaces to city-states, from fragmented societies to philosophical cultures, from Macedonian Empire to Hellenistic fusion, from Roman absorption to Byzantine continuation, and finally into modern intellectual legacy. Greek civilization did not remain static at any point in its history. It adapted, it evolved, and it persisted through every transformation of the ancient Mediterranean world. Its influence is not confined to history books or archaeological sites. It lives in language, in political thought, in literature, in philosophy, and in the structures of knowledge that still shape the modern world. And in that sense, the story of ancient Greece is not only a story of the past. It is a foundation of the present. Like and subscribe and comment what topic you would like to see covered in the next video.